My Lords, it's somewhat humbling and not a little intimidating to follow on from so many insightful speeches from those at the heart of the issue. For me, as a bit of an amateur outsider, I broadly welcome the bill, but with some reservations which I'll pursue at committee stage. For the second reading, I wanted to suggest that we should always remember the cultural and political context of our deliberations and indeed definitions used, and I'll come back to that. We also need to remember the lessons of history. Locking people up for mental illness has been mired in ethical and political scandal over many years. We all can cite the former Soviet Union, where political dissidents were labelled mentally ill. But even in democracies, it wasn't until 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association voted to declassify homosexuality as a mental disorder. And let's forget those unmarried mothers who were sectioned in the 20th century. But even this misuse of psychiatric power, it is still possible to be a defender of liberty, such as myself, I hope, yet acknowledge the need for some people to have their liberty restricted because of their mental health. Many years ago, when I worked for Mind, this was a very polarising debate, but I argued then and continue to believe that when someone is severely psychotic or manic or out of their minds, then psychiatric coercion is not a violation of individual autonomy. That's because the subject at that point in time, and this is the key, at that point in time, is not autonomous in any moral sense. But isn't release different? And that gets me to the issue of community treatment orders. I too would like them to be abolished, as others have said. The general problem of CTOs is well explained by Dr. Ken McLaughlin in his pamphlet Escaping the Straitjacket of Mental Health, where he makes the point that while the case for compulsion can be justified at the point of hospital admission, when the patient is likely to be in an acutely psychotic state, he asks if compulsion can be justified at the time of hospital discharge, when the patient should have mental capacity restored. And prior to 2007 and CTOs, on leaving hospital, an ex-patient regained their full rights of citizenship, including the right to refuse medical treatment. The problem with being released with a CTO is you return to the community as neither a patient nor as a citizen. And this hybrid state is troubling in terms of compromising civil liberties. So I tend to agree with the comments by the noble Lord Earl Howe, and others, that at the very least I'd like to challenge why the bill will allow indefinite CTOs to occur. I agree with the Centre for Mental Health's call for safeguard of time limits, and then CTOs could only be extended if there was proof of proportionality for the individuals concerned. The question of indefinite coercive orders inevitably reminds us of the plight of those almost 3,000 prisoners held indefinitely behind prison bars under the abolished and discredited IPP sentence. Many of these prisoners, many of these people are incarcerated in prisons precisely because their mental health has deteriorated because they've been refused release, even on licence. A sort of unacknowledged section is happening here. What's more, shockingly, a wide range of experts now blame this very sentencing regime as the cause of IPP prisoners' mental distress. The hopelessness, the psychological terror, as it's been described, of never-ending sentences has literally driven prisoners to lose their minds, even to lose their lives through suicide. So while I'm delighted that this bill will remove the prisons from the list of places of safety, how does this help those IPP prisoners? They are deemed too mentally unwell to be released safely. Their illness is at least partly derived from a shameful state mistake, yet IPPers are coercively detained indefinitely in institutions that this bill would have the state now deem as unsafe for those with serious mental illness. One case that has recently attracted headlines illustrates IPP's plight as it relates to the bill. 40-year-old Thomas White has served 12 years as part of his indefinite IPP for a non-violent theft of a mobile phone in 2012. According to his psychiatrist, Thomas developed his religious hallucinations and psychosis as a direct result of being on an IPP sentence. His sister Clara has been campaigning for over a year to have Thomas transferred to a hospital, but his recent assessment appointment was cancelled due to staff shortages. Clara notes despairingly, "We waited a long time to have Thomas assessed by a psychiatrist. We more than likely won't get the assessment again. The system is nothing but criminal. People like my brother are being seriously failed." James Firkin, Labour MP for Bury North, agrees. He says Thomas's indefinite imprisonment has had a huge detrimental impact on his mental and physical well-being. Thomas should be a patient, not a prisoner. Hear, hear. Things are little better for the general prison population. The annual report from the Chief Inspector of Prisons complains of high healthcare staff vacancy rates and chronic recruitment and retention issues. And in that context, Richard Garside, the Director of the Centre for Crime and Justice, concludes that the provision in Clause 35 to introduce a statutory target of 28 days for transfer from prison to hospital, while welcome, feels aspiration rather than practically implementable in the current system. This sort of broader crisis of staffing and resources and whether it will hinder the bill, as we've seen in jails, is also mirrored outside the prison gates. Many briefings for this second reading that we've all received query whether the bill will deliver its promises as a consequence of such problems. I want to raise a related concern. I think that overstretched mental health services are not just a question of resources, but rather a consequence of a recent cultural trend. That is what I consider to be the problematic medicalisation of more and more aspects of the human condition. Ever greater numbers are being encouraged, often by government-backed policies, to view normal, if adverse, perhaps painful life events through the prism of mental illness. As a consequence, greater numbers of people now demand expert pharmacological or therapeutic intervention. Over recent decades, this huge increase in classification in the psychological realm has moved the job of diagnosis far beyond the field of psychiatry. A veritable industry of counsellors, therapists and psychotherapeutic practitioners now label an ever-expanding set of behaviours as mental ill health. As the numbers of label conditions has grown, those reporting they suffer from such problems has risen exponentially. And the stats bandied around are eye-watering. According to the psychologist Oliver James, a third of the adult population shows signs of psychiatric morbidity. The problems of worklessness and sick leave that the government is rightly tackling seem dominated by those who've removed themselves from productive work because of mental health-related problems. Student Minds reports 1 in 3 students experience clinical levels of psychological distress. But as it's now claimed students might suffer PTSD if exposed to certain literary texts, it's difficult to assess the clinical authenticity of so-called mental health epidemic amongst the young. But the main thing is that the pathologising of ever more aspects of life has unintended consequences, some pertinent to this bill. For example, we risk reducing the time and resources available to those who desperately need professionals' help if the system is clogged up with inappropriate referrals and arguably overdiagnosed conditions. And finally, there's a danger of confusing public opinion if the true horrors and tragedy of serious psychotic illness are relativised and given the same mental health moniker as unpleasant but mundane psychological challenges.